Last one standing. The emergency pod's warning system pulsed an angry red, its rhythmic beeping the only sound besides Thomas Reed's labored breathing. Through the small viewport, he watched the last pieces of the research vessel Asteria drift away into the endless black of space. Just 6 hours ago, it had been home to 37 crew members. Now, he was the only one left. Reed pulled up the pod's diagnostic display, his fingers trembling as they danced across the holographic interface. Life support, functioning but damaged. Communications, offline. Navigation, severely limited. The quantum core breach that had destroyed the Asteria had also damaged his escape pod's primary systems. "This is Navigation Officer Thomas Reed of the Earth Science vessel Asteria." He spoke into the pod's recorder, trying to keep his voice steady. "Date is March 15, 2189. I appear to be the only survivor of the incident. The ship's quantum core experienced an unexpected cascade failure during our deep space research mission." He paused, watching his breath fog the inside of the viewport. The pod's temperature was dropping slowly but steadily. The heating system was consuming too much power he needed for life support and the emergency beacon. "The crew," Reed's voice cracked. "Captain Williams ordered emergency evacuation, but the core destabilized too quickly. I saw other pods launch, but the explosion—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The image of those pods being consumed by the quantum fire was seared into his memory. The pod's computer chimed, displaying his current position. The explosion had thrown him far off their planned research route, deep into unexplored space. The nearest human outpost was the Galileo station, but at his current trajectory and with his damaged engines, it might as well have been in another galaxy. Reed began a methodical inventory of his supplies, 2 weeks of emergency rations if he stretched them carefully. The water recycler was functioning, thankfully, basic medical supplies, a repair kit that might help with some of the pod systems if he could figure out how to use it properly. "I have approximately 10 days of life support at current consumption rates," he continued his log. "The pod's beacon is transmitting, but with the quantum interference from the explosion, I don't know if anyone will be able to detect it. My current position is—" He checked the coordinates again and felt his stomach sink. "My position is beyond any charted rescue routes." The pod rotated slowly, bringing a distant star into view. Its pale blue light reminded him of Earth's sun seen from orbit, but this star was a stranger, unnamed in any human catalog. He was truly alone, drifting in a part of space where no human had ever ventured before. Reed pulled up the engineering interface, determined to find some way to extend his survival time. He wasn't a technical specialist. His expertise was in stellar navigation, but 5 years in deep space had taught him the basics of emergency repairs. The pod's systems were modular, if he could shut down non-essential functions and reroute power. "Primary objective is to boost the emergency beacon's power," he muttered, falling back on his training. "Secondary objective is to extend life support duration. Tertiary," he stopped himself. There was no point in listing more objectives. Without achieving the first two, nothing else mattered. As he worked, Reed tried not to think about the faces of his crewmates. Dr. Chen, who had been teaching him ancient Chinese poetry during their long shifts. Engineer Martinez, always ready with a joke even in the tensest moments. Captain Williams, whose last order had saved Reed's life, staying behind to give the crew those precious extra seconds to reach the escape pods. The pod systems responded sluggishly to his commands as he attempted to reconfigure the power distribution. Outside, the endless stream of stars continued their cold, distant watch over his struggle for survival. Reed had always loved space, its mystery, its challenge, its promise of endless discovery. Now, for the first time, he truly understood its other nature, its absolute, unforgiving isolation. "This is Navigation Officer Thomas Reed," he spoke again into the recorder, his voice stronger now, focused on the task at hand. "Beginning emergency system reconfiguration. If anyone finds this log, tell my sister Julia that I tried. Tell all their families that the crew of the Asteria died as heroes. And please, someone find out what went wrong with that core. Don't let this happen to another ship." With those words, Reed turned his full attention to survival. He had 10 days of guaranteed life support, a handful of tools he barely understood how to use, and the vast, empty expanse of unexplored space surrounding him. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. He refused to let this be the end of his story. The emergency pod continued its lonely drift through the void, carrying its sole occupant toward either salvation or oblivion. Only time would tell which. The silent hours. Day 3 in the pod, and the silence had become a living thing. Thomas Reed stared at the emergency beacon's status display, watching the weak signal pulse into the void. He'd managed to increase its power by 17%, but the cost had been steep. The pod's artificial gravity was now offline, leaving him floating in 0G. Day 3 status update, he spoke into the recorder, his voice rough from lack of use. Life support holding steady after power redistribution. Current oxygen levels at 82% of original capacity. Emergency rations sufficient for 11 more days. He paused, watching a drop of water float past his face. Time is becoming difficult to track. The pod's chronometer still functioned, but the hours had begun to blur together. Sleep came in fitful bursts, his dreams filled with the sounds of tearing metal and the faces of the crew he'd left behind. When he was awake, he divided his time between system maintenance and staring out the viewport, searching for any sign of rescue that logic told him couldn't possibly arrive yet. A warning light flickered on the environmental control panel. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees, now hovering just above 15 degrees C. Reed pulled the emergency blanket tighter around his shoulders, his breath visible in the cold air. He'd sacrificed heating comfort for power, but the chill was starting to affect his thinking. "I keep hearing things," he admitted to the recorder. "Voices in the hum of the life support, music in the static of the communications system. The isolation experts at command warned us about this. Auditory hallucinations are common in deep space isolation. Knowing that doesn't make them any less real." Reed pulled up the navigation display, checking his position for the 100th time. The pod's trajectory had carried him further into uncharted space, far beyond the original research mission's parameters. The blue star he'd spotted earlier was closer now, its light casting strange shadows through the viewport. "The star's radiation signature is unlike anything in our database," he noted, professional curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "If I'm reading these patterns correctly, it's far older than it should be for its spectral class. The Asteria's mission was to study astronomical anomalies. Looks like I found one. Pity the ship's sensors aren't here to properly analyze it." A sudden tremor ran through the pod, causing the instruments to flutter. Reed grabbed the nearest handhold, his heart racing. The structural integrity monitors showed no damage, but something had disturbed the pod's stable drift. "Unknown gravitational disturbance detected," he reported, forcing himself to maintain the log despite his rising panic. "Source unclear. Pod sensors may be malfunctioning, but readings suggest." He trailed off, staring at the data in disbelief. "Readings suggest a massive object passing within 10,000 kilometers of my position, but visual observation shows nothing there." The tremors continued for several minutes before subsiding. Reed's attempts to track the phantom object proved futile. The pod's damaged sensors could barely maintain their lock on the nearby star, let alone identify an invisible mass moving through space. Hours passed as Reed obsessively reviewed the sensor logs, trying to make sense of what had happened. The isolation began to press in on him again, heavier than before. He found himself talking to the pod's computer, carrying on one-sided conversations about navigation theory and emergency protocols. "Julia would laugh if she could see me now," he said to the empty air. "My sister always said I took my job too seriously. All those stars will still be there tomorrow, Tommy," she'd tell me. "Take a break sometimes." His laugh echoed hollowly in the confined space. "Well, Jules, I've got nothing but breaks now, nothing but time." The pod's recycling system hummed as it processed another batch of air, the sound uncomfortably loud in the silence. Reed had begun rationing his oxygen consumption, taking shallow breaths and minimizing physical activity. Every molecule of air was precious now. Something's wrong with the star, he realized during his 18th hour of observation. The blue giant's light had begun to pulse irregularly, its intensity fluctuating in a pattern that defied natural stellar behavior. Reed's navigation training told him this was impossible. Stars didn't change their output this rapidly. He devoted the pod's remaining sensor capacity to studying the phenomenon, if only to keep his mind occupied. The alternative was dwelling on his dwindling supplies and the growing probability that his emergency beacon would never be heard. "Theory, the gravitational disturbance and the star's behavior are connected," he recorded, clinging to the familiar routine of scientific observation. "The timing of the events suggests correlation, but that would imply—" He stopped, unwilling to voice the impossible conclusion his mind was reaching. The cold had settled into his bones now, making his movements slow and clumsy. Reed knew he should sleep, but fear kept him awake. Fear of the strange phenomena outside his pod, fear of the memories that haunted his dreams, and most of all, fear that he would wake to find his oxygen finally depleted. "This is Navigation Officer Thomas Reed, recording hour 72 of isolation." He spoke into the log one final time before exhaustion overtook him. "To anyone who finds this, there's something out here in the deep black, something we never knew about. I don't know if I'll live long enough to understand what it is, but at least I got to see it. That's worth something, right?" As Reed drifted into uneasy sleep, the blue star's light continued its impossible dance through the viewport, casting shifting shadows across his floating form. In the depths of space, unseen forces moved around his tiny shelter. their nature and purpose unknown to the solitary human bearing witness to their existence. Beyond the void, the messages began on the fifth day. At first, Reed thought he was hallucinating, another trick of his oxygen-starved brain. The pod's communications array had been dead since the explosion. But there it was, a pattern of pulses cutting through the static, unlike anything in the standard emergency frequencies. Day 5 log entry, Reed spoke, his voice barely above a whisper to conserve oxygen. 0300 hours ship's time receiving, something not standard distress signals, not Terran communications protocol. He paused, listening to the strange rhythmic patterns. It's like music but not meant for human ears. The blue star had grown brighter, its pulsations now synced perfectly with the mysterious signals. Reed had stopped believing in coincidences 2 days ago when he'd noticed his pod's trajectory changing without using any propulsion. Something was guiding him, drawing him deeper into this unexplored region of space. His fingers trembled as they danced across the pod's interface, attempting to analyze the signals. The computer struggled to process the complex patterns, but what data it could interpret was staggering. The transmissions contained mathematical sequences of impossible complexity, carrying information in ways that defied known physics. I think, Reed swallowed hard, his throat dry. I think it's a language, not just data, actual communication. The patterns they're responding to my sensor scans, changing, adapting. He laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. First contact, and I'm probably too oxygen-deprived to even remember it. The pod's internal temperature had stabilized at 12 degrees C, but Reed no longer felt the cold. His mind was consumed by the patterns in the signals, by the dance of light from the impossible star. In his more lucid moments, he recognized the signs of obsession, of a mind trying to find meaning in the meaningless. But then the patterns would shift again, and he'd see something new, something that couldn't be dismissed as hallucination. The signals are getting stronger, he reported. Hours or days later, time had become fluid, measured only by the pulsing of the star. And there's something else. The gravitational anomalies, they're forming a pattern too, like ripples in space itself. Reed's navigation training had taught him to think of space as a void, empty, except for the islands of matter that made up stars and planets. But what he was seeing now suggested something entirely different. Space wasn't empty, it was alive, moving, folding in ways that human science had never imagined. The pod's sensors screamed as another gravitational wave passed through, stronger than any before. This time, Reed saw it with his own eyes, a ripple in the fabric of reality, distorting the starfield like a stone thrown into a cosmic pond. And in its wake, something emerged. This is, Reed's voice failed him as he stared through the viewport. This is Navigation Officer Thomas Reed recording first contact with a non-human intelligence. God, I wish the Asteria's cameras were here. No one's going to believe this. The object, if it could be called that, defied description in human terms. It seemed to exist in more dimensions than Reed's eyes could process, its form shifting and flowing like liquid geometry. Light bent around it in impossible ways, and the space within its boundaries seemed to contain entire galaxies in miniature. The signals changed, becoming more focused, more directed. Reed's computer chirped as it began receiving data in massive bursts. Diagrams, mathematical formulae, and what appeared to be star charts filled his screens, but they showed a universe fundamentally different from the one humanity had mapped. They're not just communicating, Reed realized, his exhausted mind finally grasping the truth. They're teaching, showing me what space really is. He laughed again, but this time with genuine wonder. All our physics, our careful maps and theories, we've been like blind men describing an ocean by touching a single drop of water. The entity, Reed couldn't think of a better word for it, moved closer to his pod. The signals intensified, and suddenly the mathematical patterns began resolving themselves into something his brain could almost comprehend. Not words exactly, but concepts, ideas transmitted directly into his consciousness. They're ancient, he whispered into the recorder. They've been here since before our sun ignited. They're the ones who shaped space itself, who wrote the laws we think of as physics. His voice rose with excitement despite his oxygen-starved state. And they've been watching us, waiting for humanity to reach far enough into the deep black to finally see them. The entity's presence had somehow stabilized his pod systems. The temperature began to rise, and his oxygen levels actually increased slightly. Reed knew he should be terrified, should be questioning his sanity, but all he felt was a profound sense of rightness. This was what he'd spent his life looking for, what every human explorer had dreamed of finding. Final log entry, Reed spoke, watching as more entities began emerging from the folded space around him. To whoever finds this recording, everything we thought we knew about space, about reality itself, is about to change. We're not alone in the void, we never were. The universe isn't empty, it's filled with wonders we couldn't even imagine. And they've been waiting for us to finally open our eyes. As the blue star's light bathed his pod in its otherworldly glow, Thomas Reed prepared himself for what came next. He was no longer drifting alone in deep space. He was about to become humanity's first student of the universe's true nature, taught by beings who had written the cosmic laws themselves. The void had never been empty. It had simply been waiting for someone to drift far enough, long enough to finally see the truth. The language of stars. Time had lost all meaning in Reed's tiny sanctuary. The pod's chronometer still ticked away the hours, but such measurements seemed meaningless now. The entities, he'd begun thinking of them as the architects, existed in a realm where time flowed differently, where past and future were as navigable as physical space. Learning log entry unknown, Reed spoke into his recorder, his voice stronger now that the entities had stabilized his life support systems. They're showing me, God, how do I even describe this? They're showing me how to read space itself. The gravitational waves, the quantum fluctuations, they're all part of a language written into the fabric of reality. The viewport of his pod had become a classroom of sorts. The architects would create stunning displays of cosmic phenomena, manipulating spacetime as easily as humans might shape clay. Through these demonstrations, Reed began to understand that what humanity called the laws of physics were merely a tiny subset of the universe's true capabilities. The star charts they've provided, he continued, gesturing to his holographic displays, they're not just maps of space, they're maps of possibility. Each point of light represents not just a star, but all the potential states that star could exist in simultaneously. He paused, watching as new patterns formed in the blue star's light. Our understanding of quantum mechanics was just scratching the surface. The architects communicated through a combination of mathematical symbols, gravitational pulses, and what Reed could only describe as direct neural impressions. Ideas would simply appear in his mind, complete and fully formed, though it often took hours or days for his human consciousness to fully process them. They're showing me why they chose to reveal themselves now, Reed reported, his eyes wide with wonder. The quantum core accident that destroyed the Asteria, it wasn't an accident at all. The core didn't malfunction, it evolved. Our experiments with quantum technology were actually bringing us closer to understanding their language. The explosion was the first word of a conversation humanity wasn't ready to hear. A sudden surge of energy from the nearest architect caught Reed's attention. The entity's multidimensional form shifted, creating a display that made his heart stop. He was seeing the Asteria's final moments, but from an entirely new perspective. The quantum core hadn't destroyed the ship, it had transformed it, scattering its atomic structure across multiple dimensional planes. They're alive, he whispered, tears floating in zero gravity. The crew, they're alive, just existing in a state we can't perceive. The architects are showing me how to understand it, how to, he trailed off as new information flooded his consciousness. How to bring them back. The mathematics involved were beyond anything humanity had conceived, but the architects were patient teachers. They showed Reed how the universe was like a vast cosmic computer, with every particle capable of storing and processing infinite information. Human consciousness, they revealed, was just one way of interpreting this endless stream of data. The void between stars isn't empty, Reed explained to his recorder, trying to capture these revelations for future generations. It's filled with layers of reality, dimensions folded within dimensions. Our universe is just one thread in an infinite tapestry, and the architects are showing us how to see the whole pattern. As if responding to his words, the entities began a new demonstration. The space around his pod seemed to crystallize, revealing structures that existed between the atoms of normal matter. Reed watched in awe as entire civilizations flickered in and out of existence in these inner spaces, each one operating according to physics that would be impossible in his native dimension. They've been guiding us, he realized, the truth dawning with stunning clarity. Every major breakthrough in human physics, every seemingly impossible leap in our understanding, they were leaving us breadcrumbs, preparing us for this moment. The quantum core technology was the final test, proving we were ready to begin learning their language. The blue star pulsed again, and Reed felt another lesson beginning. The architects were showing him something new, something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a vision of Earth, but not as it existed now. He saw his homeworld surrounded by structures that bridged multiple dimensions, with humanity finally taking its place among the cosmic engineers of reality. This is what they're offering us, Reed spoke, his voice filled with emotion. Not just knowledge, but evolution, the chance to become something more than we are, to join them in shaping the very fabric of space and time. He laughed softly. And it all started because one navigation officer drifted a little too far into the deep black. The entities continued their lessons, each revelation more stunning than the last. Reed learned how gravity could be written like music, how light could be folded into shapes that stored infinite information, how consciousness itself could be transferred across dimensional boundaries. His mind struggled to contain it all, but the architects had modified his pod systems to help record and process the information. To anyone who finds these logs, he recorded, knowing that his words were inadequate to convey the magnitude of what he was experiencing, what I'm learning here isn't just about physics or astronomy. It's about our place in the universe, about the true nature of existence itself. We thought we were alone in the void, but we were really like fish at the bottom of the ocean, unaware of the sky above. The blue star's light seemed warmer now, almost welcoming. Reed understood that it wasn't really a star at all, but a gateway, a beacon left by the architects to guide species ready to take their next evolutionary step. And humanity, through a series of events that only appeared random, had finally found it. I'm not drifting anymore, Reed realized, speaking his thoughts aloud. I'm exactly where I need to be, where we all need to be. He looked out at the cosmic classroom that surrounded his pod, at the patient teachers who had waited eons for this moment. The real journey is just beginning. The bridge between worlds. The moment of choice arrived sooner than Reed expected. The architects had shown him everything they could within the limitations of his human consciousness, and now they presented him with a decision that would change the course of human history forever. Final log entry, Reed spoke into his recorder, his voice steady despite the weight of what lay before him. The architects have given me a choice. They can send me back to Earth with the knowledge they've shared, allowing humanity to gradually discover these truths over generations. Or, he took a deep breath, watching the multidimensional beings shimmer around his pod. Or they can transform me like they did the Asteria's crew into something that can bridge the gap between our species. The blue star's light filled his pod, and within its radiance, Reed could see the possibilities laid out before him. If he returned to Earth as he was, much of what he'd learned would be incomprehensible to current human science. It would take decades, perhaps centuries, for humanity to fully understand and implement the architect's teachings. But the alternative was both thrilling and terrifying. The architects could reshape his consciousness, expanding it across multiple dimensions, allowing him to exist in a state between human and cosmic engineer. He would become a translator, an interpreter of universal truths, able to guide humanity toward its next evolutionary step. I keep thinking about Captain Williams' last words before the quantum core transformed the Asteria, Reed continued, his fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on the viewport. She said, sometimes the greatest discoveries require the greatest leaps of faith. She didn't know it then, but she wasn't giving an order to abandon ship, she was leading us toward transcendence. The architect's presence intensified, and Reed felt their patient anticipation. They showed him one final vision, the crew of the Asteria, not dead but transformed, existing in a state of consciousness that spanned multiple realities. They were waiting for him, ready to help him bridge the gap between human understanding and cosmic truth. I can see them now, Reed whispered, tears floating freely in the zero gravity. Not just the crew but all the others, every civilization that reached this point, that found the courage to take this step. We're not alone in the void, we're part of a cosmic community we couldn't even perceive before. Through the pod's viewport, Reed watched as space itself seemed to fold and unfold, revealing layers of reality he'd never imagined could exist. The architects were showing him what he would become, not just a survivor drifting in space, but a guardian of knowledge, a guide for his species' evolution. To anyone who finds this pod and these recordings, Reed spoke, his decision crystallizing in his mind, know that what happened here wasn't an ending. The Asteria's mission didn't fail, it succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. We set out to study the mysteries of space, and instead we found our place in the cosmic order. The blue star's pulsations synchronized with Reed's heartbeat as he made his final log entry. I, Navigation Officer Thomas Reed of the Earth Science Vessel Asteria, hereby record my choice. I choose transformation. I choose to become a bridge between worlds, between states of being, not for glory or power, but because humanity deserves to know the truth about our universe, about our potential. He took one last look at the pod's interior, at the small space that had been his home during this extraordinary journey. To my sister Julia, I'm not really leaving, just changing. Someday when humanity is ready, when the right people look up at the stars with the right questions in their hearts, I'll be there to answer. The architects began their work, and Reed felt his consciousness expanding, transforming. The boundaries between matter and energy, between space and time, between self and universe began to blur. His last human thoughts were of gratitude for the isolation that had led him here, for the void that had turned out to be so full of wonders. The journey that began in solitude ends in unity, he recorded, his voice taking on harmonics that no human vocal cords could produce. I am Navigation Officer Thomas Reed, and I am about to become something more, not lost in space but finally truly found. The pod's recorder captured the final moments of transformation, the blue star's light intensifying, the space around the pod folding in impossible ways, and Reed's final joyous laugh as he transcended the boundaries of human existence. The emergency beacon, which had broadcast his isolation, now began transmitting something new, a signal that would call humanity toward its cosmic destiny when the time was right. In the vast expanse of space, the empty pod continued its journey back toward Earth, carrying its precious cargo of recordings and revelations. And somewhere in the dimensional layers beyond human perception, Thomas Reed began his new role as a bridge between worlds, watching and waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to join him among the stars. The void was never empty. It was full of wonders, full of potential, full of guides waiting to show us the way. All it took was one person, drifting alone in deep space, to finally see the truth that had always been there.